We often think of revolutions as sudden explosions, a storming of a Bastille, or a shot heard round the world. But some revolutions are slow burns. They are fought not with muskets, but with pamphlets, parades, and patience. This is the story of the longest revolution in American history. From 1848 to 1920, thousands of women engaged in a relentless battle for the most fundamental right in a democracy, the right to vote. It was a struggle that spanned 72 years. It survived a civil war, a world war, and generations of ridicule. As we see in these images, women took to the streets holding signs that demanded equal rights and votes for women. They were mothers, daughters, and workers who refused to accept second-class citizenship. In this series, we will walk the path they paved. We will meet the icons like Susan B. Anthony and the warriors like Alice Paul. We will witness the brutality of the prisons and the drama of the final vote. This is how half the country finally won a voice. Every movement has a birthplace. For women's rights in America, that place was a small chapel in upstate New York. In July 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott organized the Seneca Falls Convention. It was the first women's rights convention in the United States. They expected a modest turnout, but over 300 people arrived, including the famous abolitionist Frederick Douglass. This wasn't just a meeting, it was an ignition point. Before this moment, women's dissatisfaction was scattered and private. Seneca Falls brought it into the public square. This historic gathering launched the organized suffrage movement. It created a network of activists that would sustain the fight for 7 decades. It was here that women first collectively declared that they were not just subjects of their husbands or fathers, but citizens of the Republic. At the convention, Stanton presented a document that would become the movement's manifesto, the Declaration of Sentiments. Modeled directly after the Declaration of Independence, its opening line was a radical rewrite of Thomas Jefferson's famous words. It proclaimed, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." This document didn't just ask for respect, it listed specific grievances. It attacked the lack of property rights, the denial of education, and the exclusion from the ballot box. But one resolution stood out as particularly shocking. The demand for women's suffrage, the right to vote, was considered the most radical and controversial proposal at the convention. Even some attendees feared it went too far, thinking it would make the movement look ridiculous. But Frederick Douglass argued passionately for it, and the resolution passed. The demand was made. It is impossible to understand the early suffrage movement without understanding the fight against slavery. The early suffragists were ardent abolitionists. They learned how to organize, how to petition, and how to speak publicly from the anti-slavery movement. They saw a clear parallel between the legal status of enslaved people and the legal status of women. They hoped that after the Civil War, a universal suffrage amendment would grant the vote to everyone, regardless of race or sex. However, reality was harsher. Political expediency separated the causes. When the 15th Amendment was proposed to enfranchise black men, women were told to wait. This is the Negro's hour, they were told. The universal equality they dreamed of fell far short, creating a bitterness that would haunt the movement for decades. The exclusion of women from the 15th Amendment tore the suffrage movement apart. This led to the split of 1869. On one side were the radicals, led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. They furiously opposed the 15th Amendment because it excluded women. They refused to support a change to the Constitution that introduced the word male into voting laws for the first time. On the other side was Lucy Stone. She took a more pragmatic view. She supported the amendment, viewing black male suffrage as a stepping stone to broader voting rights. This disagreement was deep and personal. It created two rival organizations, the National Woman Suffrage Association, NWSA, and the American Woman Suffrage Association, AWSA. For the next 20 years, the movement would be divided, fighting for the same goal, but marching on different paths. Frustrated by political inaction, the suffragists tried a bold legal strategy known as the New Departure. Their argument was clever. They claimed that the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to all persons born in the U.S., already gave women the vote. They argued that the Privileges and Immunities Clause of the amendment included the right to cast a ballot. To test this theory, they decided to break the law. In 1872, Susan B. Anthony marched into a polling place in Rochester, New York, and cast a vote. She was promptly arrested. This was exactly what she wanted. She hoped to take the case all the way to the Supreme Court, forcing them to acknowledge women's rights. It was a strategy of direct defiance, using the courtroom as a stage for their cause. The legal strategy culminated in the Supreme Court case Minor v. Happersett in 1875. Virginia Minor, a suffragist from Missouri, sued the official who refused to register her to vote. The case reached the highest court in the land. The suffragists waited with bated breath. The court's ruling was a devastating blow. They ruled unanimously that citizenship does not guarantee the right to vote. They declared that states had the authority to withhold voting rights from citizens. This decision effectively killed the New Departure strategy. The path forward was now clear but daunting. Judicial interpretation wouldn't work. The suffragists would have to pursue a specific constitutional amendment. They would have to change the foundational document of the United States. While the federal battle stalled, a different story was unfolding in the American West. In 1869, the territory of Wyoming did something revolutionary. It became the first territory to grant full suffrage to women. When it became a state in 1890, it kept that right, becoming the first state where women could vote on equal terms with men. Why the West? Pioneer life blurred traditional gender roles. On the frontier, women worked alongside men, building homes and communities. This reality made men more open to the idea of women voting. By 1896, Utah, Colorado, and Idaho had followed suit. The map of suffrage was filling in from the west to the east. These victories provided proof that women voting wouldn't destroy society, serving as a powerful example for the rest of the nation. After 2 decades of division, the movement finally realized that unity was strength. In 1890, the two rival groups merged to form the National American Woman Suffrage Association, or NAWSA. This marked a turning point. The movement became more streamlined and professional. Under the strategic leadership of Carrie Chapman Catt, NAWSA developed the winning plan. It was a sophisticated, two-pronged approach. First, they would continue state-by-state campaigns to build momentum. Second, they would use that leverage to push for a federal amendment. Catt's approach was conservative and dignified. She believed in lobbying, in persuasion, and in working within the system. NAWSA became a massive political machine, but for some, it was moving too slowly. We must remember that the suffragists weren't just fighting apathy, they were fighting organized opposition. The anti-suffragists were a powerful force. Their arguments played on deep cultural fears. They claimed that politics was a dirty business that would corrupt women. They argued that voting would destroy the family unit and dissolve traditional gender roles. Surprisingly, many of these opponents were women themselves. But there was also a hidden hand at work: the liquor lobby and bid industry. The liquor industry feared that women, who were the driving force behind the temperance movement, would vote for prohibition. Industrialists feared women would vote to end child labor and improve factory conditions. The opposition wasn't just philosophical, it was financial. By the early 20th century, a new generation was rising. They were tired of asking politely. Enter Alice Paul. She was young, educated, and radicalized by her time in England. There, she had marched with the militant British suffragettes led by Emmeline Pankhurst. She learned that polite requests are often ignored, but bold demands get attention. Paul believed NAWSA was too slow and too polite. She brought the tactics of the British movement to American soil. In 1913, she organized the women's suffrage procession in Washington, D.C. It wasn't just a parade, it was a statement. Scheduled for the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, it was designed to overshadow the president. Alice Paul was serving notice. The women of America would no longer be ignored. The 1913 parade was a spectacle the likes of which Washington had never seen. Between 5,000 and 8,000 marchers descended on Pennsylvania Avenue. There were floats, bands, and women mounted on white horses. It was the first major national march for a political cause, but the beauty turned to ugliness. The vast crowds of men watching the parade turned hostile. They surged into the street, blocking the path. They shouted insults, spat at the women, and physically attacked them. The police stood by and watched, doing little to stop the violence. Whatever the intent of the mob, the result was a victory for the women. The violent mistreatment made headlines across the nation. It generated widespread sympathy and support for the suffrage cause. The violence proved the suffragists' point. They needed the vote to protect themselves. The difference in style between the establishment and the radicals became too great to bridge. The movement split once again. On one side remained NAWSA, led by Carrie Chapman Catt. They stuck to their winning plan, working with the government, supporting President Wilson, and using careful political negotiation. They wanted to win by being model citizens. On the other side was Alice Paul's National Woman's Party, NWP, formed in 1916. Their strategy was direct confrontation. They held the party in power responsible for the lack of the vote. If the Democrats controlled the White House, the NWP would attack the Democrats. They were done with patience. They wanted democracy now. In January 1917, the National Woman's Party did something unprecedented. They set up pickets at the gates of the White House. They called themselves the Silent Sentinels. Rain or shine, day or night, they stood there. They held banners with provocative questions like, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" This was the first group ever to picket the White House. At first, President Wilson tipped his hat to them. But when World War I began, the mood changed. Picketing a wartime president was seen as treasonous. Critics labeled them unpatriotic. The mobs returned, attacking the picketers. The police began arrests, not of the attackers, but of the women. Hundreds were arrested for obstructing traffic. The war for democracy abroad was clashing with the war for democracy at home. The arrested women were sent to the Occoquan Workhouse. What happened there is known as the Night of Terror. The suffragists were brutalized. They were beaten, thrown into dark cells, and abused by the guards. In protest, Alice Paul and others launched hunger strikes, refusing all food. The authorities were terrified that a suffragist would die and become a martyr. To prevent this, they resorted to force feeding. They shoved tubes down the women's noses and throats to pump raw eggs and milk into their stomachs. It was torture. But Alice Paul smuggled news of this treatment to the press. When the public learned that respectable American women were being tortured just for wanting to vote, the outrage was massive. Public opinion began to shift decisively against the government. As we celebrate these heroes, we must also confront the flaws of the movement. The struggle for the vote was marred by racism. White suffrage leaders, desperate to win over Southern legislators, often excluded black women. They argued that white women's votes would counter the ignorant votes of black men. But black women refused to be sidelined. When told to march at the back of the 1913 parade, the famous journalist Ida B. Wells refused. She waited on the sidewalk and joined the Illinois delegation front and center as they passed. Leaders like Mary Church Terrell fought a dual battle for suffrage and civil rights. Their motto was "Lifting as we climb." They understood that for black women, the vote wasn't just about gender equality. It was a matter of survival against racial violence. World War I became the catalyst for the final push. While the NWP picketed, NAWSA took a different approach. They threw themselves into the war effort. Women worked in factories, served as nurses, and led Red Cross drives. They proved their citizenship through sacrifice and service. This dual pressure, the militant public embarrassment from Alice Paul and the patriotic service from NAWSA, cornered President Wilson. In 1918, Wilson finally converted. He went to the Senate and declared, "We have made partners of the women in this war. Shall we admit them only to a partnership of suffering?" The most powerful man in the country was finally on board. With presidential support, the 19th Amendment began to move. It passed the House of Representatives in 1918. Then, in June 1919, it passed the Senate. But the battle wasn't over. A constitutional amendment requires ratification by 3/4 of the states. In 1920, that meant 36 states. The ratification battle was fierce. State legislatures debated and voted. By the summer of 1920, 35 states had ratified. They needed just one more. But the southern states largely rejected it. The final decision came down to one state, Tennessee. The entire focus of the nation descended on Nashville for a dramatic showdown. In Nashville, the tension was palpable. It was called the War of the Roses. Pro-suffrage legislators wore yellow roses. Anti-suffrage legislators wore red roses. When the roll call began, the vote was deadlocked. It seemed the amendment would fail. Then, the clerk called the name of Harry Byrne. He was the youngest legislator, just 24 years old. He was wearing a red rose, signaling he would vote no. But in his pocket was a letter from his mother. It read, simply, "Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Cat put the rat in ratification." When his name was called, Harry Byrne shocked the room. He voted yes. The tie was broken. The amendment passed by a single vote. A mother's letter had changed history. On August 18, 1920, the 19th Amendment was officially ratified. The text was simple but transformative. The right of citizens to vote shall not be denied on account of sex. In an instant, 26 million women were enfranchised. It was the single largest expansion of democracy in American history. It opened the door for women in government and public life. However, the victory was incomplete. For many women of color, especially in the South, barriers like poll taxes and literacy tests would prevent them from voting until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But the 19th Amendment was the watershed moment. The longest revolution was won. The women of America had not been given the vote. They had taken it.